Hey, what's going on? I'm Patrick Jaguar, the Cosmic Alchemist, and welcome. Thanks for tuning into this video. So I've been excited about filming this one. This is my video where I'm going to talk about the December 21st, 2020 conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn. So it's a big conjunction, comes but once every 20 years, and it really, I look at this as kind of the generational reset. And while I'm thinking of it, if you like my videos, please give me a like and a subscribe and a share if you want to get these as they roll out. Things are going to keep getting more interesting, so I will keep you apprised of the astrological aspect of the current events. So anyway, so this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, I look at this as the generational clean out, because a generation traditionally and now statistically is looked at to be every 15 or 20 years. I think it's more like 20 because in 20 years a baby can become a responsible, hardworking adult if trained and raised properly. But it takes, certainly with our grandparents and people before that, they were well on their way to adulthood by 20 years. So yeah, I think I see 20 years as a generation, and that's pretty, everyone can pretty much agree on that. Anyway, Jupiter and Saturn meet up every 20 years. This is what was referred to in the nativity story, the story of Jesus' birth in the Bible. This is what's referred to as the Star of Bethlehem. And this conjunction doesn't always form one of these stars of Bethlehem. Basically, what the Star of Bethlehem is all about is, first off, planets look like big bright stars, and actually the word planet, it originates with a Greek word, and the Greeks referred to planets as wandering stars. So with the naked eye, it's tough. You really can't distinguish a star from a planet by anything except color. So planet looks like a wandering star. It travels across the sky faster than the stars. So the Greeks call them wandering stars. So Jupiter looks like a big bright planet. A big bright star, kind of a greenish star. And Mars is a lot dimmer. So right now, I'm making this video on the 19th, on the 19th of December. They're pretty close together. Today they're they've got to be close to the same degree as I'm making this. Let me check the here and now. Yeah, well, so Saturn is at 6 degrees, it's at 6 degrees 8 minutes, and Jupiter is at 5 degrees 55 minutes. So you're getting pretty close. So in anywhere in the northern hemisphere, if these next few nights, tonight and tomorrow night, if you go out into the southwest, you'll see these two stars they've been moving closer to each other if you've been watching, but in the southwest you'll see these two stars and they're really close together. They're kind of in a diagonal, kind of from lower right to upper left. And so Jupiter's catching up to Saturn. So when they come together, in years when they conjunct, they're not only conjunct, but they have the same declination. Their light kind of combines and you get a big bright star. So that's what they call the Star of Bethlehem. So, and let me explain that terminology. In astrology, when we talk about planetary conjunctions, we're talking about longitude. So we're talking about a horizontal position. So for example, this conjunction is going to happen at 6 degrees of Capricorn. We can say that two planets can be conjunct at 6 degrees Capricorn, but they might be at different heights off the horizon. Now that height off the horizon is called the declination. Now, that declination is not measured from the horizon, but from the celestial equator, which is like a celestial horizon. So that's what it's made. So that's the reference point that this measurement is made from. So you can have positive declinations or negative declinations. So this conjunction is going to take place at 6 degrees of Capricorn. Not only will Jupiter and Saturn be at the same longitudinal value, the horizontal east to west, so to speak, but they'll be at the same height. They'll be in the same declination. So they won't only be at the same horizontal point, but they'll be at the same vertical point. So they'll be one on top of the other. Now, even though Jupiter and Saturn meet up every 20 years, the Star of Bethlehem phenomenon, where they're right on top of each other, is very rare. And it actually hasn't happened since 1226, since March of 1226. So that's why in the title of this video I brought in the whole thing about the Cathars and the Cathar prophecy, and I'm going to get into that later. So it's pretty rare that Jupiter and Saturn get right on top of each other. Usually for this conjunction, it's kind of one above and one below. So it's more significant. It gives it more power. With it being said that these two planets meet every 20 years, people in the ancient world used to follow this. And if you look at the Babylonian astrology, they used to say in the ancient times that these years, this 20th year of this cycle, where Jupiter and Saturn conjunct, it was actually a really bad year to choose leaders, to choose high priests, high priestesses, kings, queens, any sort of elected official. In the old days, kings and queens were elected. So it was not seen as a good time to choose leaders. And so, in my opinion, that's why we have this curse of Tippecanoe here in the United States. So, 30-second rundown on curse of Tippecanoe. I don't want to get too deep into this because I have a lot to cover. But curse of Tippecanoe was this phenomenon on how from 1840 onwards, American presidents would be assassinated in office or they would die of an illness in office. And it is by about 1980, the presidents weren't dying, but there were being attempts made on their life. And then in 2000, you started seeing this whole thing with contested elections. And by the way, some people might get triggered by this. I really don't care. But if you're triggerable, maybe you stop the video here. But we're still in a contested election because the media has called the election for Joe Biden. No branch of government has made this official. So this is all media hype, and a lot more has to play out with this election. I'm just calling the facts here. I don't belong to a party. It's how it is. Excuse me. So, damn. Hailed a little water. So, anyway, Curse of Tippecanoe. It was called the Curse of Tippecanoe because the president who was elected in 1840 was called the Hero of Tippecanoe. That was William Henry Harrison. He was a Virginian. He was a U.S. Army officer, and he fought in some wars with the Indians in present-day Ohio and Indiana. And the war chief he was up against was the war chief of the Indian Confederation that he was up against was Tecumseh. And these Indians had their land stolen from them, and it was pretty nasty business. So Tecumseh put a curse on the American tribe, and he said, your chiefs will be cursed from here on. So William Henry Harrison. So these Indian wars were back in, I think, sometime before 1820, maybe in the somewhere between 1817, 1825, somewhere in there. So you fast forward in time to 1840. William Henry Harrison is he's no longer in the army. He's no longer a general anymore. He gets elected president, and he died about 40 days into his term. He inauguration day, it was cold and raining in Washington D.C., and he didn't wear a hat, and he got sick. So he passed just about a month into his term. 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected. He was reelected in 1864, and he was assassinated. 1880, President Garfield was elected. He was assassinated in his term. McKinley was elected in 1900. He was assassinated a few years later. Warren G. Harding, 1920. He died of an illness in office. I think it was like a stroke in, I think, 1923. FDR was elected for the third time in 1940. Re-elected in 44. Died in 44. I think it was a stroke. JFK, elected in 1960. He was assassinated in 63. Ronald Reagan, elected in 1980. There was an attempt made on his life in 1981, but he survived. So the curse was somewhat broken. Year 2000, you had, again, you had the, I think it was in May of 2000, yeah, May 2000, you had the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. There was an election in, it wasn't November 8th, it was in November 2020. You had, mind you had an election on the day where Mercury went stationed after being in retrograde. And so you had this up in the air contested election, and it took, I think, something like 37 days to sort out the 2000 election and send it to the Supreme Court and the whole bit. And then President Bush, you know, George W., who was elected that year, there was an attempt made on his life when he was visiting Georgia, not the U.S. state of Georgia, but the country over in the Caucasus between Turkey and Russia. So a hand grenade was thrown at him that never went off. And then so 2020, we had an election on November 3rd, Mercury stationed after being in retrograde in Libra in the sign of politics. So we're in this contested election again. So it seems like the presidents are out of the woods, but it's like the whole election process is kind of in jeopardy now, and both parties are doing all kinds of dirty shit to try to win. It's not just the party you hate, because we're ruled by narcissists. I mean, that's a fact you need to accept as an adult. And doing that requires you to recognize your own narcissism. Otherwise, you know, you'll refuse to think that about the TV personalities that we call politicians that you like. So anyway, the electoral process seems to have something going on with it. It's just these years are bad years to pick leaders. So our leaders as Americans are either dying, or the elections are becoming increasingly, I guess, dubious, you could say. So that's kind of the deal with that. So in the ancient world, they wouldn't choose rulers. They wouldn't elect rulers in those times. So, you know, in those ancient rulers, it wasn't, not just anyone could become a king or a queen. You had to come from a royal family, but in these royal clans, there were many people to choose from. So, you know, that's the deal with that. I want to walk you through now just kind of the general gist of this year's conjunction. So, well, you know, before I do that, I want to go to mythology a little bit. So Jupiter and Saturn, they're also known by the Greek names Zeus, Zeus is the Greek name for Jupiter, or Jupiter is the Roman Latin name for Zeus. And then Saturn's other name is Kronos. So in the mythology, Saturn or Kronos was one of the Titans, and he was Father Time. Saturn still governs time, also authority, also the common people too, but it's all about the law, following the law. So Saturn is Father Time, and Saturn was said, or Kronos was said to have ruled the Golden Age. And as a Titan, he actually overthrew his father, who was Uranus, who was the ruler of the sky before him. And Uranus is the ruler of Aquarius. Well, one of the rulers, Saturn and Uranus, they kind of share the duty. So Saturn had overthrown his father, who was also a Titan. And Saturn was then overthrown by his own son, who was Zeus or Jupiter, who went on to basically bring together the Olympian pantheon, so the group of the gods of Olympus. So in the mythology, the cosmos went from being ruled by the Titans, who were like these giants, basically like these forces of nature, these raw forces of nature, to then be ruled by gods, who were also forces of nature in and of themselves, but gods are forces of nature and forces in the universe, spiritual forces that we anthropomorphize, that we give human personalities to, human appearances and personalities. So we can basically interface with them and wrap our heads around them. So anyway, Jupiter overthrew his father Saturn. So that is why in the ancient world they didn't select leaders in these years. And that's why with our American presidents, that's why they either get assassinated or they die in office, or now we have these crazy, controversial, contested elections. So it's a year when Jupiter and Saturn meet up. It's a year, and it's a time, and it's especially a day where there's this overthrowing going on. So the rebel son is overthrowing the father. And so it's like I said, it clears out the energy for a new generation. Now, the whole world isn't reset every time Jupiter and Saturn meet up. The institutions continue on, and thoughts and memes and norms and all that stuff continue on. But basically the old generation just sort of is forced to step down, and the new generation steps into their shoes. And this is good, but when ideas and values and institutions that don't serve our evolution and are corrupt continue on, then it's not so good for the younger generation, because they should have their own chance. Now, with that being said, there are a lot of great traditions that should last through the ages, but we have to have discernment of knowing, are traditions practical? Are they good? Do they serve us? Do they help us? Or do they just give old people control and just give old people the ability to just wield power and guilt over younger people? So that's the discernment we have to use. So anyway, yeah, Jupiter and Saturn coming together, it kind of clears out the old generation. So you have this overthrow, because Jupiter comes up behind Saturn and overthrows him, and Jupiter takes Saturn off of his throne, just like he did in the mythology, or just like Zeus overthrew Kronos, or Jupiter overthrew Saturn. So, and this is kind of a karmic thing, because of the mythology. The mythology basically tells us that it's just part of our karma as humans, that we can't stay in control forever. Nobody can rule forever. No individual, no group, no system, no empire, no corporation. You can't rule forever. It's enjoy it while you have it. All glory is fleeting. All personal glory and all collective glory is fleeting. So enjoy it while you have it, because you're not going to have it forever. So that's what Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is all about. It's all about kind of clearing out the old and in with the new. Now, obviously these have been going on for a long time, and there's still a lot of injustice in the world. There's a lot of corruption. There's a lot of excessive materialism. You can't, in this world, you can't be purely spiritual. There's always going to be money. Unless you're on an agricultural barter system, there's always going to be money, and that makes it convenient, because that allows you to fly to Europe and go on vacation and have some medium of exchange that people want to accept for the goods and services that you want to buy. So money's not going anywhere, and I don't think money should go anywhere, especially if we want to go into the space age. I'm going to make a video on Bitcoin, because that's what that digital currency is. That's how we're going to get into the space age. But anyway, there's always going to be money. It's just we have to have the right attitude about it. So yeah. So my whole point is that things have come, even though new generations physically take over, just institutions and beliefs and values and ideas that don't serve us, like excessive materialism or corruption or just outdated institutions, they persist sometimes when they shouldn't. And it would be better for us if they did not persist. So, but the interesting thing about this year is that you have Jupiter and Saturn in this perfect conjunction. Not only are they at the same place horizontally in Capricorn, at that 6th degree of Capricorn, but they're at the same declination. So they're at a negative 20 declination. They're actually 20 degrees below the celestial equator. So when you have one of these Star of Bethlehem conjunctions where the planets are right on top of each other, I look at this as a deeper cleaning. And, we're going to go into some of the history of that, but let's just talk about this year. As you see with my little sidebars and tangents, I get a little ahead of myself. So let's start off by looking at this year. We'll kind of get a little primed up here. I'll kind of get us all primed up. I'm still warming up too. All right. So I pull up Winter Solstice. So, and that's another thing. The Winter Solstice, it takes place December 21st through, the 24th, because basically what happens, Winter Solstice is when the sun, from our point of view in the northern hemisphere, it's when the sun rises at its lowest point south on the horizon. And this is the whole thing about Jesus dying for 3 days and rising again. This is because the sun, after September 21st, after the fall equinox, the sun keeps going south, and then on the 22nd, 23rd, and 24th, the sun keeps rising on that low point that it reached on December 21st. So that's the whole thing. Jesus was the historical Jesus, who was a king and a teacher, or he was a royal heir and he was a teacher. He was turned into a sun god. So the sun every year dies by going south into the underworld. It dies for 3 days. It stays at that low point. Then on the 25th of December, the sun is reborn because it goes 1 degree north on the horizon where it rises. So that's where the whole thing about Jesus dying for 3 days and resurrecting. It's because the sun dies for 3 days and resurrects. So really the biblical story of Jesus is all astrology. So that's what the winter solstice is. It's the sun goes to its December 21st, goes to its lowest point on the horizon. South stays there for 3 days in the underworld and then rises again on the 25th. So that's why they say Jesus was born on the 25th of December. There's no documentary evidence supporting Jesus being born on the 25th of December, but there have been about 300 solar gods all across the world who were all born to a virgin on December the 25th, who had 12 helpers or disciples. So it's an old story. So not only does this winter solstice take place on December 21st, but Jupiter and Saturn are conjuncting on December 21st. So it's an even more powerful winter solstice. So it's kind of this generational house cleaning, but because this generational house cleaning, this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, is taking place at the time when the sun is reborn, it's going to lend a certain amount of rebirth to the world. It's spiritual rebirth, and this is going to carry into our daily lives slowly but surely. So to me, it's like humanity's kind of getting a new lease on its life that it hasn't had in, I don't know, a good 2,000 years or more. So let's look at the specific day. So December 21st, 2020. This Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is, again, it's at 6 degrees of Capricorn. It's happening in the second house. So Capricorn is government, it's authority, it's society. Second house is wealth. So this is basically signaling a reordering of government and wealth. You know, in the United States, our business is business. You know, the country was set up as a republic and as basically a place where you could pursue, you know, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. So pursuit of happiness has to deal with being able to find gainful employment and get ahead in the world and build some wealth for your family. That was a lot of what was implied. And money's not everything, but being materially secure has a lot to do with your happiness. I don't care what people say about that. That's a big part of being happy. So with this Jupiter-Saturn conjunct in Capricorn, the second house, this is heralding a financial reordering. Now, Pluto in, what is that now, in January, no, excuse me, I think it's December the 30th. Yeah, December 30th, Pluto is going to transit into Capricorn in the second house. So this will be a Pluto return for the United States. When the United States was born, Pluto was in Capricorn in the second house. So on a Pluto return, anytime a planet makes a return, it basically kind of puts you back on course. You know, reminds you of who you really are. So the second house of the United States is going to have to really sort through a lot of problems, you know, and our banking system is very corrupt. We've been dealing with this whole Federal Reserve System, which is really the government. You know, people have been fighting about Donald Trump and Joe Biden, and well, really, Jerome Powell is the real president of the United States because, you know, he's the chairman of the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve is a cartel of investment banks like J.P. Morgan, Bank of America, Goldman Sachs, Chase Manhattan, you name it. So when they want war, the government gives them war, and when they want something, they get it. And when presidents try to take power away from them, they often lose their lives. So, which was in the case of JFK, Abraham Lincoln, the bankers were bribing him. He didn't want to get bribed. He got taken out. And Ronald Reagan was questioning the very existence of the Federal Reserve, and he got shot, and then he shut up. So we're going to go through a whole financial reordering. So this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction, plus while Jupiter is just, 1 or 2 degrees away from this conjunction, while it's still close to Saturn, Pluto is going to come into Capricorn. So yeah, this is heralding a big financial reorder, and a reordering of government in a way, because finance and government are just so intertwined, you can't separate them. Because politicians always need money and governments always need money. So it's like the bank always kind of will be the government, but if it's a bank owned by the people and owned by the government, then basically we're in charge. But if it's this private banking cartel like the Federal Reserve, then the bank is in charge, and the government is almost meaningless in a way. So we need to get a handle on this, and I think it's coming. So some other things going on, if we look at, I put Sagittarius in the ascendant house because the United States is a Sagittarius ascendant. We get that Pluto at 29 degrees on the day of the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction on the winter solstice. Then we have Sun at 5 degrees, Mercury at 6 degrees. So, the ascendant house of the United States is Sagittarius, and Sagittarius is philosophies and its belief systems, its beliefs, it's your worldview, it's your spirituality. So, United States is a country founded on beliefs. It was about, not just the King of England and the British Parliament could boss everyone around. It was about common people having some say in their lives. Now, granted, the people who signed the Declaration of Independence, they were aristocrats in their own right, and they were definitely, a lot of them were very wealthy and they were looking out for their own interests. But what the country they were starting was so much better than anything else that was out there, and it was imperfect. And yeah, a lot of these people owned slaves, which is extremely fucked up, but they were thinking ahead. And one thing I have to point out is a lot of these guys were Freemasons, and I call this country the Masonic States of America. And I don't see the Masons as evil or anything like that. There have been some, in Masonic lodges, some underhanded people do some recruiting because they're trying to garner influence, for their bosses, for their overlords. People in government and business and banking, they use Masonic lodges as a means of recruiting useful people. But, Masonic values are actually about equality of all people and equality between men and women and, all that kind of thing. So the founding fathers in this country were putting something into motion that they weren't even really ready for. Like, they really weren't even ready for this whole idea of, all men, all humans are created equal. Thomas Jefferson wrote that. He was an interesting guy. I think he did believe that, but he also owned slaves. I think he didn't know what to do without his estate and without that plantation. He didn't have the courage to let that all go. And I think too, as a wealthy person, in the American South back then, people were kept in line by their peers. So if you start treating your slaves really well and freeing them and kind of letting them sort of do, live life the way they want, then I think back then there was a pretty good chance that the other landowners would take your land away from you if you were, being good to people like that. Because then the ideas start spreading. It's like the It's like that movie, The Free State of Jones, with Matthew McConaughey. You know, he's a guy, he's part of a group of people who are living in a Confederate state during the Civil War, who want to break away from the Confederacy. And the Confederates come in, the Confederates who are saying that they're fighting for freedom from the tyranny of the Union, then come in and tyrannize these people who want to break away and have their own community that's unaffiliated. So there's a lot of nuance, you know, with the Founding Fathers. So it was an imperfect thing, but it was like the original American dream. They were getting an idea started that they really couldn't even handle and they weren't ready for, but it was part of their Masonic values and they knew they had to do it for the sake of the future. So, you know, it's like I tell people, it's like, man, if you think the cops are bad here, it's like, go to Africa, because they're pretty, you know, that's one place, they're pretty nasty over there. You know, and I tell people, it's like, if you think Americans are racist, wait till you meet the Chinese. So it's not perfect here, and we have a lot of work to do, but it's a hell of a lot better than really most other places. And even progressive places in Europe still have an economic class structure and class system that restrict mobility, unlike anything we have here in the United States. So it's not so bad here. It needs work, but it ain't so bad. So, well, holy shit, that was a tangent. So getting back to the ascendant house of the United States, Sagittarius, you get that Pluto at 29 degrees. Pluto, god of the underworld, basically helps us dig deep and shows us things that are going on deep within us. So Pluto at 29 degrees of Sagittarius is showing us what's really deep down in our beliefs, in our belief systems. Now we also have Sun and Mercury there. Sun's at 5 degrees, Mercury is at 6. So the Sun is, you know, rulers, figures of authority. Mercury is it's the intellect, it's communication, it's also media. So basically, you know, at this time, we've got the media is all over the national leadership and is talking about it, but it's selling us only one point of view about it. And Sagittarius can get very extremist and self-righteous because we get very preoccupied with the correctness of what we believe. So, you know, Sun is the soul, it's also the ego, Mercury is the intellect. So we're very focused on what we believe, but we're also very self-righteous and closed-minded about it and are not seeing the other side of issues. So Neptune, 24 degrees of Aquarius in the 3rd house. So Neptune is both a great revealer and a great deceiver. It depends how attached you are, how emotionally attached you are to beliefs and outcomes. If you are very emotionally attached to beliefs and outcomes that you need to be true, then you're not seeing what's really going on. So you're not open-minded. So then Neptune, you know, your inner Neptune will deceive you. Whereas if you're not attached and you can make room for new ideas, then you're open-minded. So Aquarius is the sign of we the people, and 3rd house is communication. It's also media. So basically media, you know, independent, the mainstream media outlets, the big powerful ones, you know, Fox News, CNN, MSNBC, blah, 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 you know, BBC, whatever. They're all running propaganda right now, and they're pushing it on the people, and they're deceiving people who, no matter what political side they're on, they're using it to deceive people who are emotionally attached to a belief in an outcome. And are not making room for other things to be possible other than what they think is the truth. So then fourth house, which is Pisces, we have Mars and the moon. So Mars is at 28 degrees of Pisces. That's a Gandanta degree. So there's like anger and volatility stirring, which I think is really going to pop in January. And so the moon's there, anger on the mind, Uranus is in the fifth house in Aries. So, and it's retrograde. Uranus is kind of overturns status quos. And Aries is all about taking the initiative. It's about leadership. And the fifth house is one of the signs, one of the houses that deals with politics, because fifth house deals with art and it deals with performance, and politics is a big performance art. And Rahu Ketu axis, it's the 6th and the 12th houses. So you got Rahu in the 6th. So Rahu is an illusionist. Rahu gives us, one thing Rahu does is Rahu gives us it gives us obsession to be good at something, to be perfect at something, but Rahu also fools us. So 6th house is the house of enemies and conflicts and struggles. And so when you have Rahu here, you can really deceive yourself about who's the real enemy, who's the real threat, who is it that I'm really struggling against. And then Ketu in the 12th house. 12th house is well, let me back up. Rahu in the 6th house. It's in Taurus. Now Taurus is it's about wealth, but it's all about wealth gained by your efforts, by being industrious and being your own self-advocate. So Rahu is at home in Taurus, and Rahu is all the things that we want in this life. So Rahu being in the 6th house in Taurus, it's like Rahu has the ability to, through his own efforts, to help us get what we want through persistent effort and through struggle, and even through service. Now Ketu being in the 12th, Ketu is also at home because it's in Scorpio, and it's in a moksha house, which is the 12th house. So moksha is liberation from this world. It's like spiritual liberation. So Ketu, as I said, is at home in Scorpio. Scorpio is the sign of life and death. It's the sign of transformation. It's the sign of deep issues, of deep thoughts, deep emotions, of secret things. So Ketu is kind of Ketu is all about spirituality. Rahu is more material and about getting what he wants, and Ketu wants nothing. Ketu has no emotional agendas and no desires and just wants nothing. So Ketu likes the 12th house because the 12th house it's the other world, it's isolation, and it has a lot to do with spirituality. So Ketu in the 12th house in Scorpio, it's basically about finding freedom through transformation by digging deep into ourselves. Now Venus is going to be at 13 degrees, whereas Ketu is at 25. So Venus is if Venus is the human planet, it's considered to be the most empathetic to the human condition. So basically Venus is helping us to dig deep, to find that freedom through transformation, that spiritual liberation through transformation. Another thing too I see here though is that 12th house rules losses. So in Ketu, whenever Ketu comes near a planet, it kind of cuts things loose that have to deal with that planet, that sign, that house. So, this could even be kind of losing friendships, maybe losing like diplomatic ties. I think, all the dispute going on with the election, I think there is something to it. And, people think it's a conspiracy theory that somebody could have rigged the election. Well, And they say who would steal an election from Donald Trump? Well, the same people that stole it from Bernie Sanders. Bernie Sanders was hugely popular. I think he got screwed out of a nomination, a presidential nomination, twice. And you look at Joe Biden, the most unpopular candidate in U.S. history, but he gets nominated even though Bernie is so popular. Hillary Clinton was pretty unpopular too. But Bernie, like Trump, is an outsider. So the whole point with that is that the Chinese are really, they have world domination ambitions, and they have infiltrated our government and our universities and our corporations already. And I see Joe Biden as their horse in this race of the presidential election. So I think there's a chance that this election may overturn, and if that happens, yeah, we're going to lose our diplomatic relations with China. And it's funny that China is calling for Donald Trump to step down to have a free and fair election, even though Xi Jinping is now dictator for life in China. I don't know what business they have to advise anyone on elections, free and fair elections. But 12th house is also deals with foreign places. So another thing here is that it's freedom and transformation by cutting foreign ties. So it could be a really good thing. So, that's the deal with this one. Now, one last thing about this 2020 conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn, because they're at the same declination, at the same height relative to the celestial equator, they're actually 20 degrees below it. Because they're right on top of each other, I think this is a lot deeper than the 1961 Jupiter-Saturn conjunction. Now, real quick about that. Jupiter-Saturn conjunction was February 18th, 1961. That was also in Capricorn. That brought about a lot of governmental change. That conjunction brought us things like the civil rights movement, which was extremely overdue when it finally came in 1964. But that set the stage for massive governmental change, and it really cleared out a lot of beliefs of the old generation, and the racism and sexism that went with that. So that really set up the 60s, but for all the good that happened in the 60s, there was a backlash against that, and even there was a civil trial that dealt with the JFK assassination, and then there were CIA hearings on assassinations in the 1970s, and basically Central Intelligence Agency, by the courts, by the Senate committees, was found liable for the death of President Kennedy. So there was a backlash against all these positive things that were starting to happen during the 60s. And I think it was MLK, Martin Luther King, Robert Kennedy. They were all taken out by the same groups. There's a whole, when you look into this stuff, there's a whole MK Ultra component to it, with those assassins, or at least the people who were set up as the assassins. Malcolm X too. These people who were bringing about positive changes were dealt with by people who wanted to maintain the status quo. And then in the 60s, you had Vietnam, and I think Vietnam was really a way to derail all the changes in consciousness and the changes in society that were going on for the better. It was about money too. There was a lot of money that was made in Vietnam, but everything that happened in the 60s wasn't like a triumph of humanity. Even the hippie movement was basically infiltrated and hijacked. and there was a lot of psychological experimentation that went on within that movement. But, you know, the 60s had a good start. Now, I think this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction is going to be more powerful than the one in 1961. Because, for one, you have Jupiter and Saturn right on top of each other. They're at the same degree of declination, at that negative 20 degrees of declination. And I find that in my read of this, the positions of Rahu and Ketu are much more fortuitous. You know, 1961, you had Rahu and Ketu, and you had Rahu in Leo and Ketu in Aquarius. And, you know, they're in the 3rd and the 9th houses. Now, this year, you've got them in their home signs, and in the 6th and the 12th houses in the chart of the United States. So, you know, the 6th and the 12th houses, it's about struggling for freedom. And this whole transformation that has to take place to accomplish that. So I think this is going to be a much deeper cleaning than the Jupiter-Saturn conjunction in 1961 that did give people traction to get ahead in life and to live better lives. So this is going to be a lot more profound in my opinion. Now, the other part of this video that I want to get into, the whole thing about the Cathar prophecy. So we haven't had a Jupiter and a Saturn in the same declination forming this star of Bethlehem, this big bright star, since it was in March 1226. Now, see, this is a tricky thing here. The calendars are a really difficult thing. So if you look this up, you know, everyone says March 4th, 1226. My software, I use Parashara's Light. It's Vedic astrology software. It puts this conjunction at March 12th, 1226. Calendars are a really tricky thing because in 1226, the Western world was on the Julian calendar, and we're on the Gregorian now. It's called the Gregorian calendar because it's about the mid-1500s, Pope Gregory the Sixth, I want to say, basically had a new calendar set up. And the way they did this, and you can look this up, he brought in a bunch of German mathematicians to restructure the calendar, but he also, they took the Mayan calendar that the Spanish had just raided from Mexico. You know, the Spanish raided a bunch of Aztec and Mayan documents and they shipped it all to Rome. You know, basically in the age of colonialism, you know, with the exception of the Protestant countries, in the Spanish Empire, really, you know, being the worst of them, they were allowed to go loot these places in the Americas, but they had to give half the wealth they looted to the Vatican, and they had to send, you know, any documents or artifacts of significance. And a lot of this stuff is still in the vaults under the Vatican, which not a lot of people get to go into. So a lot of these Aztec and Mayan documents, and among that was the calendar that counted down to December 21st, 2012. That calendar was sent to the Vatican, and so the Pope gave these German mathematicians, who were the best in the world at the time, gave them this calendar and tasked them with syncing the calendar of the Western world to that Mayan Aztec calendar, because it was so precise. They recognized how precise it was. It was better than anything the Western world had. So, and before the implementation of the Gregorian calendar in the 1500s, the Julian calendar had been corrected a few times, and then the Gregorian calendar has gone through some corrections since. So it's just difficult because a year is something like 364 and 3/4 days. It's not precisely 365 days. So over time, this fraction of the day really screws things up. So yeah, my software says March 12th, 1226, whereas, I don't know, you look up NASA or whatever, they say March 4th, 1226. They don't have it perfect either. I don't have it perfect. It's, you know, they say time doesn't really exist. Time's a funny thing when you try to measure it. So it was March 1226. I mean, it's about as much as we need to know. Early March. So you had Jupiter-Saturn in meeting up in Capricorn at the same declination. And it was actually, they met up at 19 degrees, 53 minutes of Capricorn. So that's just shy of the 20 degrees that negative 20 degrees that they're meeting up at now. So they're at the same degree point, at the same declination that they were in 1226. So in this sense, we've come full circle to 1226. And I think it's all about kind of wrapping up unfinished business from those days and sort of healing old wounds. So that's why I brought the Cathars in. Now, who the hell are the Cathars? So I could talk about that for hours. I'm not going to. I'm already about an hour. But the Cathars were a spiritual movement and a social movement in southern France. In the its center was in southern France, I should say. And that's a funny thing, is when you get here in in the English-speaking world, whether that's U.S., Britain, Canada, you get a hold of books about the Cathars. They say it was a social and a spiritual movement in southern France. Well, when you get over to France and you find books over there and you read the plaques on the monuments, you see that it was actually a movement that was all through Europe. It was in Spain, it was in northern Italy, it was in Switzerland, it was in Germany, it was as far away as Poland. And this movement had actually, it had some roots in the Balkans. So it was all over Europe. Now, they were anti-church. They were Christian, but they were anti-church. Now, today you have the Catholic Church and you have all these Protestant denominations. Those Protestant denominations are basically Catholic. They're about at least 90% Catholic. Everything they have comes from the Catholic Church. They don't remember what the religion of the historical Jesus, not the Son God Jesus, but the historical Jesus. They don't remember what he practiced. So they're all Catholic. So this Cathar movement, they were practicing basically that same religion, because the people who were at the head of the movement were actually descendants of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. So, or descendants of that whole family that he was part of. So they were anti-church. They were basically, their whole thing was that you don't need clergy to help you talk to God or communicate with God. That's something you can do for yourself. They weren't, I wouldn't say they were anti-materialist, but they were not all about living life from a material point of view. You know, they still had the leaders of this Cathar church didn't have private property, but you know, people who adhered to the faith did have property. They were actually aristocrats who were part of this faith, and it was all about basically not being greedy and, you know, helping people out and being of service to other people. Now, another interesting thing is they called themselves the Albigensians. So in French, this basically means the elf people, because ALBI, it was a word for elf, and gens or gens in French means people. So it was the elf people, and you know, really this gens, it's related to the word gentry, and gentry were nobility. So, you know, the elves weren't like Keebler elves. They weren't like 2 foot tall little elves that live in the ground, but they were the elves. It was a term for this extended family, this bloodline of, you know, these Merovingians, these Fisher kings, these Scythians. They were, you know, part of this old bloodline, this old clan that the historical Jesus was actually a part of. And before the church started overthrowing these people in the 500s and basically putting corrupt merchants onto the thrones in Europe, this extended family, you know, which had thousands of members, they were the majority of the rulers throughout Eurasia, you know, so from Ireland all the way to Western China, and even arguably Japan too, before Japan was invaded by people from Korea and from China, because the indigenous population in Japan were actually called the Ainu, and they're still around. There's not many of them, but they're paler, they're taller, and in the 1800s they still had a lot of red hair. So, and they're still discriminated against in Japan. So there was this extended family where the royal houses and like the druids all across Eurasia. So, and this spirituality supported these people, these elves, this ancient bloodline, as being the rulers and the, you know, the high priests and high priestesses, because of their links to the ancient world. And when you get into that, that goes back to Mesopotamia, to Sumer, and they're also called the dragon bloodline, and they drew their lineage back to this figure Anu, who was the king of the Sumerian gods, and then his mother Tiamat, who was the original dragon queen. So these people who were the heads of this spiritual movement in France, these elves, these Albi, and there's still a town in France, southern France, called Albi, where after the church drove this movement underground, they built this giant cathedral out of bricks, which I think is still the largest brick structure in the world, as just kind of it was like a who's boss kind of thing, that they built this cathedral. So these Cathars, these Albis, these Albigensians were anti-materialistic and they were anti-church, and it was just all about pure spirituality. So what was going on in 1226 was that it was in the middle of a crusade that the Vatican had launched into France. Most people don't know that a crusade was launched into France. They know about the ones in the Middle East, but basically this movement of people, the church hated them because their ancestor was the historical Jesus. They knew the true, and they get into this, people have gotten into this in stories like the Da Vinci Code, which is based on history. So these people didn't want to be Catholic, and they knew that the Gospels especially were taken completely out of context, and that the church was teaching falsely about these. And the church kept warning them and telling him, you need to stop spreading this message, you need to become part of our program. They weren't going to do it. So in 1209, the church gave their last warning, and it was Saint Dominic actually started the Dominican order, who became the Inquisitors. So people have heard of the Spanish Inquisition. That was run by the Dominican order of priests, named after Saint Dominic. So not nice guys. They were the torturers. They were the interrogators and the torturers who were extracting all these confessions of torture, these confessions out of people via torture. So they would get these heretics to confess to selling their souls to the devil and doing all this crazy shit after they'd, tortured them, done all kinds of brutal things to them. So that's where the Inquisition comes from. It started in 1209. So 1209 to 1229 was when this crusade was formally running, and things were still going on after that. But during this crusade, it's estimated that 1 to 2 million people died during this, and there weren't a lot of people around back then in France, so that was a lot of the population. A lot of people lost their lives, they lost their property. There were nobility, there were aristocrats who supported this spiritual, anti-materialistic movement, and they were doing good things for their people, and they were kicked out of their their houses were dissolved, and they lost their titles, their land, all that stuff. The House of Toulouse, the Count of Toulouse was the largest city in this area in southern France, in the Languedoc, and the House of Toulouse was dissolved. There was no longer this Count of Toulouse. That family was no longer the Counts of Toulouse, and you can even go to a city called Montélimar in the south of France, over in the Rhone country, and there was a family called the Adamars who survived this whole period. But at that time, there were two rival brothers, two Adamar brothers. One was pro-Vatican and one was pro-Cathar, pro-Albigensian. And the one who was on the side of the Cathars was driven out. You can still go to these castles and at the top of the hill in this town, Montélimar, and the castle of the brother who was pro-Vatican, it's now a museum and a heritage site, and just 100 yards away from that one is the castle of the heretic brother, and it's still standing, but you can't go into it. So it's almost like they're still being shamed to this day. So it's pretty interesting. So this brutal crusade went on for 20 years in the south of France, and one of the most dramatic events of it was actually not until 1244. It was when the last holdouts were basically burned at the stake. It was at Montségur. Montségur was considered by some to be, the Grail Castle from the legends. And the reason for this is, I think there were spies within the castle, and they reported it was like 200, I can't remember how many, 200 and something Cathars in this castle. When they eventually broke the siege and came out, 4 of them were missing. And Montségur it's on this crazy, it's this big outcropping of rock. It's surrounded on 3 sides by cliffs. There's one way in or out. 4 people were missing, and some people believe a bunch of artifacts and documents were missing along with them. So there's this idea that they may have climbed down the cliffs before the siege was broken. So, yeah, but that wasn't until 1244, after the crusade ended in 1229. But 1229 was the official end, but the persecution was still going because the Cathars were still around. They weren't as public, but they weren't exactly hiding either. So, what you had here was, again, March 4th or March 12th, 1226, you had Jupiter and Saturn meet up 20 degrees Capricorn. So, what you had here was, again, Capricorn is the sign of government, of officialdom, of society, and and even the people, because Saturn rules Saturn kind of rules society's underdogs and kind of underprivileged. So you had this kind of reordering going on, and it's funny because you had actually, let me double check this. The Rahu Ketu axis was through Leo and Aquarius. I just want to check. Oh no, they're flipped. So yeah, I was gonna say, in 1961 you had Rahu in Leo and Ketu in Aquarius. Now, yeah, 1961. So Ketu in Aquarius. K2 is like that spiritual liberation and freedom. It was in Aquarius, which is the people. So the people in 1961 and the years going forward got a measure of liberation and freedom. But in 1226, when this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction happened, you had Rahu in Aquarius and K2 in Leo. So it's like the rulers kind of got their way. Well, at least for a little while, instead. But with this one in 1226, the Cathars definitely lost in the short term because they were driven underground. A lot of people were killed, but I think this kind of marked, really. It started to mark a warming of the medieval period, because I think in this period the church really started losing its grip that it had had for several centuries. I think the church started they persecuted the Cathars, they persecuted the Templars, and so many people after that, because they knew they were losing power, and they knew that people understood how oppressive they were. And then, interesting thing too, I think the Cathars were kind of the roots of Protestantism, because Martin Luther used the rose as a symbol on his coat of arms, and the rose was heavily used by the Cathars, and also these elven and these dragon bloodlines. So, an interesting thing was, when you went forward to the 1500s, there was a huge Protestant movement in southern France, in this Cathar country. So they weren't destroyed. They went underground, but they weren't destroyed. And that's kind of what the prophecy is all about. So that's a decent segue here. Now, this prophecy is said to have been made in 1321. So 1321, the Cathars were, they weren't operating in absolute secrecy, but they weren't advertising either. And the head of the Cathar order they were called Perfectis, or perfects. It was all about you know, it sounds kind of egotistical and bombastic, but it was about striving for spiritual perfection. And in my opinion, it wasn't saying that that person was perfect, but it was their whole this leader, this Perfecti, this perfect. His or her purpose was about being the best example possible about how to have this spiritual perfection. Now, so his name was Guillaume Bélisbaste. So Guillaume is just the French William. So yeah, Guillaume Bélisbaste. He was burned at the stake at the castle at Villerouge-Termènes. So Villerouge means like Red City, weirdly enough, kind of like the Red Wedding or something. But in 1321, he'd been arrested. He'd been betrayed by a spy, kind of in his social circles, and was turned into the Inquisition. And he was burned at the stake at this castle. But the prophecy he was said to have made shortly there before, and I quote, was, "In 700 years, the laurel will become green again. Good people will return." Some people say love will return. So, end quote. So, quote, "In 700 years, the laurel will become green again. Good people will return." End quote. Or, "In 700 years, the laurel will become green again and love will return." They used a different language. It wasn't just Old French in those days, but it was Old Occitan. It was the Languedoc, because France had the Languedoc, Languedoc, so it was two different languages. So the Languedoc, it was Old Provençal. It was the old Southern French language. Not easy stuff for anyone to translate. So there's a little play in the translation. But so he's saying, in 700 years, good people will come back, love will return. He mentions the laurel in this quote. The laurel was a plant that for them symbolized love. So, and I'm not talking about romantic love, but just universal love, for all humanity, for all life, even for the earth even. And these Cathars, they conducted a lot of their services just out in nature. I made a trip in 2016. I made a trip to this region because my dad's family came from this region originally. And I went to this place. I couldn't get a lot of great pictures because of the light, but you can look it up. It's called the Cathedral Cave, and it's this giant opening that you could literally put a church inside. This big cave opening, and there's like a little altar in there and a place where you can see where they had shrines, in the old days. So anyway, that's the laurel symbolized love. But yeah, so it was love for nature, for the earth, for all humans. Not that romantic love, but the universal love. So he made that prophecy in 1321, and he said 700 years. Well, we're going to be at the 700-year mark in 10 days. So 2021 will be the 700th anniversary. So he was saying that, the church and the Inquisition and, the greedy usurper kings, these non-rightful kings and queens have the upper hand right now, but it's not going to last forever. So to come full circle and tie this all back together, we're having the first star of Bethlehem, which is when Jupiter and Saturn are in the same declination, and they're right on top of each other. We're having the first perfect conjunction of Jupiter and Saturn since 1226, since that crusade was going on. Now, the prophecy was made almost 100 years after that crusade ended. But it was the theme. He was this Guillaume Bélisbaste had he was most likely raised by other people who were in this Cathar movement or this Albigensian movement, and to be the head of the movement, he would have had to have been from an elven bloodline, a dragon bloodline himself. This whole thing about the elves and the dragons, that's why Mary Magdalene is always portrayed in artwork with strawberry blonde hair, with ginger blonde hair, because that's what they looked like. They were very, it was this large extended family with tens of thousands of people, and they only married one another. To keep they were all about keeping their bloodline pure, because they had extremely strong intuitive abilities, and they had the ability to harmonize with the earth and know how to take care of it. So that's why she's portrayed that way, because that's what they looked like. They were ginger blonde with green eyes. So I think this is why the media ridicules gingers. I think it goes a long way. I think there are people in power, talking secret societies, who would just like to see these people gone. But call it conspiracy theory, but there's a lot of old grudges in the world. So anyway, yeah, Guillaume Bélisbaste would have had to have been part of this group, part of this elven bloodline, and he had been raised to, and groomed to be a leader. So even though he made this prophecy almost 100 years after this Jupiter-Saturn conjunction took place in 1226, he knew that things had looked really bad since before he was born, and they were going to continue to look bad for years, but eventually the truth would be known, and spirituality would have a rebirth, and just fairness, and and even in universal love would have a rebirth, and people would treat each other the right way. Now, I looked up some other things, with some references here to the good people. So, the prophecy talks about, good people will return. Now, the Cathars or the Albigensians, or even just people from outside the extended family, in the leadership, who shared this faith, they called themselves the bon homme et des bonnes femmes. So, the good men and the good women. So, you look at, so bon homme or bon homme means good man. Now, you fast forward to Benjamin Franklin. He was a member of multiple secret societies, and he was like a James Bond of his day. I think like a triple agent between the 13 colonies and the British and the French, and all those groups that had agendas, and Franklin was playing them all against each other. Ben Franklin wrote Poor Richard's Almanac, and that was the really the roots of the modern Farmer's Almanac, and he called this thing Poor Richard's Almanac. Now, there was a ship commissioned during the Revolutionary War, which was donated by the French, and the Americans renamed it the Bonhomme Richard, or the Bonhomme Richard. Now, in the U.S. Navy, there have been two Bonhomme Richards ever since. There was an aircraft carrier in World War II, and now there's basically a landing ship, like a troop transport ship that carries Marines and helicopters and all that kind of stuff. So it's interesting that the United States Navy still has this Bonhomme Richard, but the Bonhomme, good man, that was a name for the Cathars. So it's funny that Benjamin Franklin was using this, because again, that original Bonhomme Richard was named in Ben Franklin's honor because he had written the almanac. So, you know, unbeknownst to most, but unbeknownst to some, the United States has preserved the memory of these Cathars. And, you know, the United States, you know, and its military have not always acted the way that the Cathars said that people should treat each other, you know, with love, but kind of maintain this memory. And I thought that was really interesting. So that's about it. I'm almost an hour and a half here. This is one of the longer ones I've done in a while. But yeah, that's the point with this whole thing is, you know, love and justice and equality and all that stuff. It's making a comeback, but all that's got to come from inside you. You know, that's not going to come from voting from a certain person, from being part of a certain party, because party politics it's become apparent, or if you're seeing clearly, it's become apparent how hateful it is, and we've always known that there were, you know, right-wingers that were very hateful. Well, the left wing since 2016 has shown us just how hateful they really are. And they've gone above and beyond in a lot of ways. They've gone above and beyond the, you know, the hatred of the right wing, because the right wing always let people say what they wanted to say, even if they didn't like it. They might have ridiculed them and, you know, tried to ruin them publicly, but they could still say it. But the left has been in this whole censorship campaign, and the Inquisition, they were, you know, these Catholic priests who were killing and torturing people, they were running a big censorship program, and they were the original fact checkers. It was this Dominican order of inquisitors, of this Holy Roman Inquisition. So there's not going to be a party a political party that gives you this, that returns this love and justice and equality and, you know, humanity to the world. It has to come from you. So anyway, thanks for tuning in. If you want to see how these current events affect you, getting an astrology reading from me is a great way to do that. I can show you how the charts of the current events affect your birth chart. And one thing I also do with every reading is I give a custom-made meditation that you can use to basically get in sync with these planets. And it's all about getting in sync with your personal life path and just being the truest version of yourself possible. I also do rune readings. Rune readings are a great way to basically put together a mind map and see, you know, what's going on well in your internal world and where you're blocked and how to rebalance it. And I give you a custom meditation with that too. I also have a couple of videos for sale for download, some Qigong videos. And Qigong's a great mind-body practice that helps you just get in touch with your energy. When you do that, you're starting to access your unconscious mind. And you can start making positive changes in your life. You know, you have to go farther than just self-help books and just putting more words and more thoughts in your conscious mind. So thanks for tuning in. You know, please give me a like, share, and subscribe if you like these videos. And I'll talk to you later. Have a good one.